Complete the frequency table using the following data. So we have favorite subjects of a fifth grade class, and we've got a bunch of students that have completed a survey saying that their favorite subject was maybe math or maybe English or maybe science. And they want us to complete this frequency table so that we can see how many times certain students said a certain kind of subject as their favorite, right? So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a frequency table to tally up the number of occurrences, right? So remember that word frequency. Frequency is the number of times, right? So if we're talking about frequency, we're talking about the number of times, right? The number of occurrences or the number of times that something happens, right? So we're trying to figure out the number of times that people chose math, the number of times that people chose science, social studies, etc., right? So we're going to create a table, and this table is going to look something like this. So we need a column for the subject, right? We need a column for the subject. So we'll create something like this, right? So we'll create a column for the subject, and then we'll create a column for the tally. Create a column for the tally, and then the frequency, and then this thing we call relative frequency, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so let's start with this, right? So this is the actual subject. So we're gonna talk about the subject, right? So we'll put the subject there, right? And we've got, we have math, right? And then we have, so we'll do math, favorite subject, right? Math. We have English. We have social studies. We'll do social studies. We have science, right? And then that's it, right? So we had our 5 core subjects, and they want us to figure that tally out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just create a tally. And if we remember something like a line plot, right? Remember on a line plot, we had a certain line, and we had a bunch of numbers, and we'd tally everything up like this, and we'd either put a dot or maybe we'd put an X or something, and that would tell us the number of times that something happens. That's our frequency. We're going to do the same thing here, but instead of X's and dots, we're going to just use a tally. So let's count up the number of people that chose math as their favorite subject. So we have 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to just tally that up, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're going to do the same thing with English. English has 1 and 2. English isn't this favorite subject for this 5th grade class, so we have 1, 2. Social studies have 1, 2, 3. So we're going to have tally of 1, 2, 3 for social studies. And then we had, last but not least, science. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people like science, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then an extra for 6. Okay, so those are our tallies, and that tells us the number of occurrences, the frequency. And we're also going to actually write out the number, and we actually just call this the frequency section. So frequency right there. And we're going to write the number that corresponds to the number of tallies, right? So there are 5 tallies here. That's a group of 5. So we'll write 5. For English, we had 2 tallies. For social studies, we had 3 tallies. And for science, we had 6 tallies. Okay. So far, we've created our frequency table, and we've given the tally and the frequency. There is one thing that we also can do. We call this the relative frequency. There's one last, well, actually, really, there's 2 things, but we'll start with relative frequency. relative frequency, and that is the frequency of one single category or subject to the total number of occurrences or frequencies. So if we quickly draw a total here, so we say total. We don't worry about the tally chart, so we need to worry about that. But we will say that the frequency, this is the sum of everything. So we had 5, and then 7, 10, and 16. So there were 16 kids, right? 16 kids, right? We had 4 groups of 4. And our relative frequency is going to tell us the fraction essentially to the subject to the total frequency to the actual total number of people. So let's start with math, right? Let's start with math here. And math, there were 5 out of 16 people that liked math or said math was their favorite subject, right? And relative frequency is always relative frequency, which is the relative frequency, which is the subject or the single category, right, over the total, right, over the total. We always want that in simplest form, right? Always. We always want fractions in simplest form, so we need to check for that. Now, 5/16, they don't share a common factor, right? You can't, nothing that fits into 5 fits into 16, so we're not going to worry about it. So 5/16 is our relative frequency for math. Now, if we take a look at English, right, we can take a look over here at English. I'm going to write that over here. We have a 2 out of 16, right? There were 2 out of 16 people that said English was their favorite subject. But this is not a simplified fraction, right? We have 2 even numbers, so we can divide those both by 2, right? We'll divide the top and the bottom by 2. And that will end up with 1 on the top and 8 on the bottom, right? So our relative frequency for English is 1/8. Social studies was 3 out of 16. And because 16 and 3 don't share a common factor, we're good there. And then science, we had 6 people out of 16. We can divide, right? We can divide by at least by 2, right? Because those are even numbers. So if we divide 6 by 2, we get 3. And if we divide 16 by 2, we get 8. And 3/8 is a simple fraction. It's in simplest form. They don't share any common factors. So we can leave that as is. Okay. So our 4 relative frequencies were 5/16, 1/8, 3/16, and then 3/8. And then the last thing that you might see in a frequency table, we call this the total frequency or the cumulative frequency. The cumulative frequency. And that is the same thing as the total. So if you ever see something where they ask you to write the cumulative frequency, that actually would just be our 16 here. That's the total, because cumulative means all, right? It means everything. It's a inclusive term, and that means the total frequency of our tally chart. So you just would add up the frequency chart. You can either do the tallies or you can do the frequency numbers themselves, and that would give you the cumulative frequency.